Hey everybody, Marcus here. In the last video, we covered the concept upon which all feminist epistemology is grounded on, namely the situated knower. Now, in this video, we will explore standpoint theory, the first of three feminist epistemological theories built upon this concept. Now, as we explore this theory, you will find that most of it is already familiar to you, in one way or another, as we have encountered from, well, feminist rhetoric. Standpoint theory begins with the situated knower. In addition to this, it posits that epistemic privilege is inherent in certain standpoints over others. Now, let us explore this idea a little bit. At first, we need to clarify the way the term privileged is used. More specifically, epistemic privilege. Now, epistemic privilege needs to be understood as a good thing in standpoint theory. It needs to be understood not as something one needs to check, but something that gives a person a desirable form of authority. An authority that necessarily demands that said authority should be obeyed. Now, to clarify this, let us start with an extreme example of epistemic privilege and work our way towards more subtle forms. The most extreme example of epistemic privilege can be found when you compare a blind man with a man who can see. Now, the man who can see has epistemic privilege by virtue of the fact that he has sensory access to something that the blind man does not. In this example, in all cases, the man that can see will be in the authoritative position to comment on things like, aesthetics, judging distance, and any number of other areas that benefit from eyesight. Given the choice on who should be making decisions in relation to anything that benefits from eyesight, the blind man should always defer to the man who can see. The man who can see in this way has epistemic privilege and therefore authority. A more subtle example is that between a doctor and a patient. Now, due to the situatedness of the doctor's perspective, specifically his know-how situatedness, the doctor has epistemic privilege compared to the patient in all things related to medicine. The doctor then should be regarded as the authority due to this epistemic privilege and be deferred to by the patient. Finally, let us look at the parent-child relationship. Once again, the situatedness of the parent grants them epistemic privilege for a wide range of things, and due to this epistemic privilege, the parent should be the authority over the child. So, as we can see from these examples, there is an interplay between epistemic privilege, the situatedness of a person, and authority. In a formal way, according to feminists, a complete standpoint theory must account for the following things. 1. The social location of the privileged perspective. 2. The scope of its privilege. What questions or subject matters it can claim a privilege over. 3. The aspect of the social location that generates superior knowledge. For example, social roles or subjective identity. 4. The ground of its privilege. What is it about that aspect that justifies a claim to privilege? 5. The type of epistemic superiority it claims. For example, greater accuracy or greater ability to represent fundamental truths. 6. The other perspective relative to which it claims epistemic superiority. And 7. Modes of access to that perspective. Is occupying the social location necessary or sufficient for getting access to the perspective? Now, standpoint theories are mainly used to claim epistemic privilege over socially and politically contested topics on behalf of the perspectives of systematically disadvantaged social groups relative to the perspectives of the groups that dominate them. Now, in other words, standpoint theories classically create an oppressor and oppressed dichotomy and try to work out how epistemic privilege behaves under such a dichotomy. Here, it should be understood that the oppressor has social privilege, which he should be checking, and is perceived in the negative way in this case. But because the oppressor has social privilege, he will lack epistemic privilege. This type of standpoint theory classically claims three types of epistemic privilege over the standpoint of dominant groups. First, it claims to offer a deep surface knowledge of society. The standpoint of the disadvantaged reveals the fundamental regularities that drive the phenomena in question, whereas the standpoint of the privileged captures only surface regularities. This assertion means that the oppressed can see fundamental problems in society, whereas the oppressor can only see superficial problems. This assertion is granting epistemic privilege to the oppressed, well, because potato. Secondly, it therefore claims to offer superior knowledge of the modality of surface regularities, and thus superior knowledge of human potentialities. Where the standpoint of the privileged tends to represent existing social inequalities as natural and necessary, the standpoint of the disadvantaged correctly represents them as socially contingent and shows how they could be overcome. In this assertion, the oppressed are once again granted epistemic privilege, but in addition to this, the assertion explicitly states that the oppressor will look upon the order of things as natural and therefore necessary. This means that the oppressor will believe that things should be the way they are, because that is the natural order of things. Third, the classical view of standpoint theory claims to offer a representation of the social world in relation to universal human interests. By contrast, the standpoint of the privileged represents social phenomenon only in relation to the interests of the privileged class, but ideologically misrepresents these interests as coinciding with universal human interests. Now, this assertion, simply put, is that the oppressor will only act in their own best interest, believing that that interest is best for everyone. The implicit assumption here is that the oppressed will either not work in their own best interest, or if they do, that interest is in fact correctly the best interest of everyone. Again, potato. Now, where do the feminists get the idea for standpoint theory? Well, clearly from Karl Marx. Marxism offers the classic model of a standpoint theory, claiming an epistemic privilege over fundamental questions of economics, sociology, and history on behalf of the standpoint of the proletariat. Now, the only thing missing from the Marxist formula is to replace the bourgeoisie with men and the proletariat with women, and we end up with the feminist epistemological system known as standpoint theory. Feminist standpoint theory claims an epistemic privilege over the character of gender relations and of social and psychological phenomena in which gender is implicated on behalf of the standpoint of women. Now, the interesting question we might be asking ourselves is, how exactly did feminists compare themselves to the proletariat and men to the bourgeoisie? Well, there are three criteria under which they have done so: centrality, collective self-consciousness, and cognitive style. Now, let us elaborate on each of these points. Let us start with centrality. Women are central to the system of reproduction, of socializing children and caring for bodies, as workers are central to the system of commodity production. Because women are in charge of tending to the needs of everyone else in the household, they are in a better position than men to see how patriarchy fails to meet people's needs. Men, in virtue of their dominant position, have the privilege of ignoring how their actions undermine the interests of the subordinates. The epistemic privilege of women, therefore, rests on the fact that they have superior access to information about whose needs are served under patriarchy. As we can see from centrality, feminists partially anchor their epistemic privilege on women's role as baby makers and housework. Now, even if that was the case, that these factors did in fact grant such a woman epistemic privilege, it would only be in the case of a woman who indeed has children and is a housewife. In an ironic way, the modern childless career woman could in no way justify a claim of epistemic privilege. The irony grows even thicker, considering that the most militant feminists are indeed childless career women. So under their own rules, they would need to exclude themselves from those who fit this situatedness, and therefore concede that they themselves have no such epistemic privilege. However, let us move on. The second justification is collective self-consciousness. It is described as follows. Male dominance is based on sexual objectification, which involves mystification. In objectification, dominant groups project their desires onto subordinate groups and, in virtue of their power, make subordinate groups conform to the way dominants want them to be. It represents as given, natural, and necessary the group differences that are caused by dominant group desires. Gender is the mode of objectification constituted by erotic desire, the eroticization of domination. Men constitute women as women by representing their natures as essentially sexually subordinate to men and treating them accordingly. Women can unmask these ideological misinterpretations by achieving and acting on a shared understanding of themselves as women, that is, as a social group unjustly constituted by sexual objectification. Women act collectively on this shared understanding in resisting the sexist representations made of them, through campaigns against sexual harassment, pornography, restrictions on reproductive freedom, and so forth. Through these feminist actions, in which women refuse to act as sexual objects, women show that representations of women as sexual objects are not natural or necessary. Their privileged knowledge is agent self-knowledge, made true by being put into action. Now, there's a lot going on in that description. In essence, it suggests that men, as the supposed dominant group, oppress women by molding women into being sexual objects, because that is apparently what men want. Now, women, in turn, can collectively refuse to be seen as sexual objects by, well, from my reading, making themselves as sexually disgusting and undesirable to male desire as well as possible. Now, I may have been a little hyperbolic in that last statement, so let me be a little bit more generous. What the collective self-consciousness thesis seems to be saying is that men have defined women based on what men want. As apparently men want sex, they have designed the female identity to serve as a masturbatory tool. Women, to free themselves of this, need only to rebel against those aspects of male design that does not conform to the female condition as designed by women. Now, the claim that women's epistemic privilege stems from agent self-knowledge, I would have to assert as, well, superficially true. I mean, after all, only women know what it is like to be a woman, and as such, only women can define woman. However, what necessarily follows is that if it is true that female identity was handcrafted to the desires of men, then every deviation from this identity leads to a less desirable woman in the eyes of men. Now, though I do not see a problem with women becoming disgusting to men if that is a side effect of their self-actualization, we can clearly infer that such a woman will have worse odds at getting a man. Now, liberation in this way may very well lead to women dying alone and childless. You know, whatever makes you happy. Now, despite all this form of epistemic privilege women claim for themselves is also an epistemic privilege possessed by men as far as the existential position of being a man is concerned. If this is the case, then collective self-consciousness is hardly worth mentioning as scoring points for some overarching epistemic privilege on the part of women. The third grounding on which standpoint theory feminists claim female epistemic privilege is cognitive style. Now, it is described as follows. Some early versions of standpoint theory accept feminist object relations theory, which explains the development of stereotypical feminine and masculine traits in terms of the different problems of identity formation faced by male and female children raised by the female caregivers. Object relations theory postulates that male children form their masculine identities by separating themselves from their mothers, a task that involves a need to maintain distance and boundaries by controlling and denigrating the feminine. Female children acquire their gender identity through identification with their mothers, and so are more comfortable with a blurring of boundaries between self and other. The development of gender identities leads males and females to acquire distinctively masculine and feminine cognitive styles. The masculine cognitive style is abstract, theoretical, disembodied, emotionally detached, analytical, deductive, quantitative, atomistic, and oriented towards values of control or domination. The feminine cognitive style is concrete, practical, embodied, emotionally engaged, synthetic, intuitive, qualitative, relational, and oriented towards values of care. These cognitive styles are reinforced through the distinctive types of labors assigned to men and women. Men having a near monopoly on the theoretical sciences, war-making, and on positions of political and economic power, calling for detachment and control, and women being assigned to hands-on emotional care for others. The feminine cognitive style is said to be epistemically superior because it overcomes the dichotomy between the subject and object of knowing, and because an ethic of care is superior to an ethic of domination. Ways of knowing informed by the motive of caring for everyone's needs will produce more valuable representations than ways of knowing informed by the interests of the dominant. They will produce representations of the world in relation to universal human interests rather than in terms of the interests of dominant classes. To institutionalize the feminine way of knowing, however, would require overcoming the division of mental, manual, and caring labor that characterizes capitalist patriarchy. Now, this description makes a great deal of assertions that can be easily attacked, but I will focus only on 2 points. The first is the mention of feminist object relations theory. In it, as asserted by the description of cognitive style, it asserts that the masculine and feminine styles emerged as a function of an upbringing by a female caregiver. If indeed feminists believe that the masculine way of knowing is inferior, then they cannot blame the patriarchy for this product, as they have asserted in their own theories that it stems from women raising boys. In addition to this, either women are intentionally raising boys to possess this so-called masculine cognitive style which they so hate, or men are inherently different from women. That aside, the more interesting claim is this. The feminine cognitive style is said to be epistemically superior because it overcomes the dichotomy between the subject and object of knowing, and because an ethic of care is superior to an ethic of domination. Now, there is a delicious confession in this statement. If you collapse the subject-object dichotomy, then all you are left with is the subject. This is a solipsistic position. It entails that nothing exists but the knower. Not only is this the pinnacle of narcissism, but it is also, in the end, a Luciferian claim, for those who are familiar with the nitty-gritty details of Christian theology. Though I will not argue the point here, an ethics of care is not actually a normative ethical model, nor is this ethics of domination that they talk about. I mean, these are buzzwords. However, what collapsing of the subject-object dichotomy does do is make ethics impossible. Think about the statement, my body, my choice. Now, imagine that a woman holds this conviction, but in addition to this, sees all of reality as an extension of her body. What ethical model can be put into place now? If indeed all of reality is an extension of her body, then any ethical model would necessarily need to put restrictions on what she can do with her body. Now, this is logically contradictory to the whole my body, my choice mantra. From this, it follows that this ethics of care catchphrase leads to a contradiction, or ethics of care entails putting restrictions on what women can do with their bodies. Okay, the final justification feminists put forward for female epistemic privilege is oppression. Yep. Women are oppressed and therefore have an interest in representing social phenomena in ways that reveal this truth. They also have direct experience of their oppression, unlike men whose privilege enables them to ignore how their actions affect women. The logic of an epistemology that grounds epistemic privilege in oppression is to identify the multiply oppressed as multiply epistemically privileged. Within feminist theory, this logic has led to the development of black feminist epistemology. Now, the leap of faith that needs to be taken is that oppression entails epistemic privilege. So far, this has been an unproven assertion, but I will not argue this case at the moment, as that's not really the point of this video. Now, the next question that needs to be raised about standpoint theory is who has access to the standpoint we have so far been describing? Now, it might come across as self-evident that only women have access to this standpoint. However, most versions of standpoint theory represent the epistemically privileged standpoint as an achieved, not a given, perspective, requiring critical reflection on the power structures of society and the relations of one's group to it. So, feminists have two takes on access to this epistemically privileged position. The first is from objectivity, and the second from subjectivity. Now, those that side with the subjective view make a simple claim. In order to have the mentioned epistemic privilege, you must yourself be a member of the group. Therefore, you must be a woman. On the objective side, which, as said earlier, is the dominant view in feminism, it is not necessary or sufficient to merely be a woman. What is necessary and sufficient is to spend a lot of time thinking about it. So in this way, a man can have this feminist epistemically privileged knowledge if he listens and believes. However, he cannot ever be a source of such knowledge, and therefore must always take the lead of women. In other words, if we go back to the analogy of the blind man and the man who can see, the blind man is the male feminist, and the one that can see, a female feminist. The blind man can have access to epistemically privileged knowledge only by believing the testimony of the man who can see. But the blind man can never contribute to the pool of knowledge that requires sight. So, what are the goals of feminist standpoint theory? Well, it goes as follows. Feminist standpoint theory is a type of critical theory, as this term was understood by the Frankfurt School of Critical Social Theorists. Critical theories aim to empower the oppressed to improve their situation. They therefore incorporate pragmatic constraints on theories of the social world. To serve their critical aim, social theories must 1. Represent the world in relation to the interests of the oppressed, 2. Enable the oppressed to understand their problems, and 3. Be usable by the oppressed to improve their condition. Critical theory is theory of, by, and for the subjects of study. From this, we can conclude that the goal of standpoint theory is literally women studying themselves. Therefore, when a woman goes to get a major in gender studies, she is really majoring in herself. Now, this concludes the overview of standpoint theory. Now, before I close off this video, I wanted to make some observations based on everything presented so far. Now, we can clearly see where people get the impression that feminism is nothing more than cultural Marxism. Standpoint theory, through its own confession, is based upon the initial precepts set out by Marx, and through the replacement of means of production by social phenomenon, the accusation of cultural Marxism, well, it makes sense. However, we cannot stop at this conclusion and claim we understand the full breadth of feminist epistemology. Though standpoint theory is Marxist, it is only one of the three branches in feminist epistemology that form the ravings of feminists worldwide. After all, standpoint theory does not account for aspects of feminism, like social construction of gender or toxic masculinity, and many other ideas we have now come to associate with feminism. No. To find out where those ideas come from, we need to move on to the postmodernist view of feminist epistemology. However, what we also get from standpoint theory is the roots of what we call the progressive stack. Standpoint theory splits up the world based on gender, and so if we stick with standpoint theory alone, we only get a progressive stack with two parts, men and women. The inclusion of race, sexual orientation, and other dividing qualities that create additional segments of the progressive stack are not found in standpoint theory. The demonization of straight white men cannot be inferred from standpoint theory. Only the demonization of men can. Now, oppression is implicitly and explicitly built into the core of standpoint theory, but not into the concept of the situated knower. Now, this is interesting because oppression is never defined in feminist epistemology in a non-circular way. Women are oppressed because of the patriarchy. What is the patriarchy? A set of systems and structures that benefits men at the expense of women. What this means is that standpoint theory, at least on the surface, is predicated on an unproven premise, but there's something else that is even more interesting. Because the concept of the situated knower is not predicated on oppression, it is possible to construct an anti-feminist, feminist epistemological theory. For example, MGTOW can easily do this by basing epistemic privilege on the concept of gynocentrism. It would be a waste of time to do so, but nothing in the concept of the situated knower would prevent us from engaging in such a project. What is also very interesting is the stated goal of standpoint theory. It refers to the pragmatic concerns of social theory. Now, earlier in the video, we had brought up that feminists put more weight towards an ethics of care versus an ethics of domination. Though we had put forward some quick arguments in dismissing the ethics of care option, another argument can be made to show the internal inconsistency of standpoint theory. If indeed the stated goal of standpoint theory is to press for the pragmatic aspects of social theory, then it would be antithetical to push for an ethics of care, even if such an ethical model could exist. The reason for this is that those who ultimately resort to violence would need to be subdued through some form of dominance. This means that ultimately any ethics of care, if possible, would necessarily need to be constructed on the foundation of an ethics of dominance. The dominance of the non-violent over the violent. After all, you cannot empathize away someone hitting you in the face. Another criticism of standpoint theory is that there is no non-circular way of deciding which standpoints grant epistemic privilege. From this it follows that picking the female standpoint is arbitrary. Yet another fun objection to standpoint theory is that ultimately, if the goals of standpoint theory are achieved, then with oppression go all the perceived advantages. Now, let me explain. If the feminine ethics of care provides an epistemically privileged perspective on morality, then our access to moral knowledge is predicated on the continuation of existing gender relations, which produces this ethic. Grounding epistemic privilege in feminine cognitive styles therefore forces a choice between having ethical knowledge and living in a non-sexist society. Now, this is quite funny, because a non-oppressive society would cause this ethics of care knowledge to vanish, and we would need to revert back to dominance-based ethics, which standpoint theory claims is the current model. So whether women are oppressed or not, our ethical model will always be the same, the one we have now. Now, there are a lot of problems with standpoint theory. Now, due to these problems, within feminist circles, you have a slow move away from standpoint theory as the dominant model and a shift towards intersectional feminism. Now, the reason for this is that feminists are coming to grips with the idea that they cannot create or justify a unified female standpoint. From this conclusion, intersectional feminism emerges. Now, the fuel for this shift, however, is pressure from postmodernist feminists. Now, I don't want to talk too much about intersectional feminism at the moment because it will be an important phenomenon when I cover postmodernist feminism in the next video. For now, however, let me tell you that intersectional feminism, it's just awesome. I mean, it really needs to be encouraged because ultimately it's so going to destroy feminism. But for now, hope you enjoyed this video, and thanks for listening. Go team.